Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Kevin DeLeon is still on the LA City Council. Residents are attempting to organize a recall election against him, but there's no reason why the Democratic National Committee couldn't let this guy know that he better step down or he'd be primaried before now. It's obvious to everyone what DeLeon thinks he's going to do. He's desperately hoping that if he can just hang in there long enough, he can ride out the storm. The headlines will change, interest will fade, and he can get away with it. And why not? There's plenty of precedent for it. Ralph Northam in Virginia, Michael Bloomberg in New York, Hillary Clinton, and a number of others. No matter what they do against black people, as far as they're concerned, well, if they just hunker down, the white media is not really going to take them to task. And that being the case, they can just wait until the brouhaha blows over and that'll be the end of it. On that recording, it was the soon-to-be out-of-office Gill DeLeon who said that all these black people who are making noise, why, there's only 25 of them. But DeLeon was the one who chimed right in after that and said, they shout like they're 250 when there's 100 of us. Then he went on to add, but when you actually pull the curtain, you see the little Wizard of Oz. Now, first of all, that is as cut and dried us versus them as it gets. And also, when he's saying you pull back the curtain and see the little Wizard of Oz, in other words, what he's saying is that black people are weak, black people are a non-factor, and black people need to be ignored. He just came out and said it. And he knew exactly what he was saying. This wasn't some teenager with a smart mouth who doesn't know anything about the world. This is a middle-aged man who loves to brag about his close connections to the black community. The little Wizard of Oz. He's a liar, he's been caught out, and now he's trying to say whatever the world he thinks he has to in order to save what he thinks is going to be left of his career. Now, if this DeLeon creep had gotten the same overbearing, hyperactive, hysterical treatment that Kanye West is getting, he would have made out his resignation letter weeks ago. But obviously he's waiting to see what Negroes might come to his rescue and stand behind him for a photo op. Sadly, he may not have to wait long, but in the meanwhile, he's been forced to do some interviews, one of them with Tavis Smiley of all people, Tavis Smiley who, in spite of himself, actually managed to make a few good points.
Do you really believe that there should be fewer black members on the city council? Put another way, do you think that black folk in this city, and going out of your comments on the tape, and what the purpose of that meeting was with you and your Latino colleagues, do you believe that there should be fewer black members on the council? Do you believe that black folk in this city are overrepresented? And so what we're talking about today is not just you and your colleagues on that tape using racial epithets. We're not talking about pediatric racism. We're not talking about harboring ill will. We're not talking about racial animus. We are talking, Councilman, about a meeting that y'all convened to come for us.
No, sir.
Let me finish.
Sure.
Because I see it differently.
Okay.
Y'all were coming for us, man. Y'all convened a meeting, and the purpose of that meeting was to do exactly the opposite of what you just said. Nothing wrong with being pro-Latino. I ain't mad at you about that. But y'all were actively engaging in a process to be anti, not just us, but anti everybody else, and anybody but Latinos. Put another way, y'all were plotting. Y'all were plotting against us. This was about the active disenfranchisement and demeaning of black fellow citizens. Do you further understand, and I say this respectfully, not with any arrogance or hubris, but had it not been for black people and the Civil Rights Act and black people, and y'all couldn't have been in that room as elected officials to plot and plan against us. That's the irony of this. As I said, it violates what you all were saying on that tape, violates the absolute spirit of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, without which you couldn't have been there as elected officials. Luis Martinez wouldn't have been president of the city council. You wouldn't have been the leader of the state senate. Were it not for the struggle and the sacrifices of black people, and then for those black people to hear y'all on a tape talking about us in that way. That's a lot to process. That's a lot to swallow, man.
Now, before anyone gets carried away, let's not make a saint out of a sinner. Tavis Smiley beat around the bush, but tried to make it sound like he wasn't. He made a few good points, but nothing extraordinary. The problem is Tavis Smiley is slavishly following the white media narrative that the whole racism scandal in the LA City Council is only about Nuri Martinez and her 3 other racist pals in that room. Smiley talks as if it goes no deeper and no further than the 4 of them, and once DeLeon is sent packing, that will be the end of it. For a guy who likes to talk about systemic racism, he seems too dense to realize that there's systemic anti-black racism that's been going on in LA, and a lot of it has been coming from the Hispanic community. And he seems terrified to have that conversation, even though the Hispanic community themselves have admitted it. Tavis didn't want to say that. The activists in LA are saying it. The Hispanic community themselves are saying it. You cannot honestly say that you want to talk about this incident without being brutally honest about why it happened in the first place, and Smiley went out of his way to avoid that. The reason it makes Smiley so uncomfortable is because he spent his entire life avoiding the simple truth that the black grassroots have been saying all along. White supremacy is not based on anti-Hispanic bigotry, or anti-Asian bigotry, or anti-Semitism, or anti-Indian sentiment, or any of those other things. White supremacy is based on one thing, and one thing only: anti-black racism. And what that means is these other non-black groups out there, well, they don't really have the same motivation to fight white supremacy as we do, because, as white power has shown over the last 500 years, it can incorporate these non-white groups to be buffers to reinforce anti-black racism. Whether it be the Irish and the Germans in the 19th century, the Italians, the Jews, and the Southern Europeans in the 20th century, and more recently we've seen these techniques used regarding Asians and Hispanics. Now, the problem for Tavis Smiley is when you've spent your life looking for allies that didn't exist, then you just can't let it go, and that's his problem. He's still holding out for that great racial alliance, but that's not all. He's also desperately hoping that he can get his old job back at PBS. He's been kicked out of the walled city, but he thinks if he just shows he's willing to play the game, they'll let him back in, eventually. But he knows if he's going to have even a snowball's chance of that happening, he better talk a certain way, and he also better not talk a certain way. Well, you cannot knock out anti-black racism if you're going to pull your punches. This is not a hard conversation to have at all, but if your goal is to make sure that nobody is uncomfortable with you, especially at the group level, well, that's going to make it impossible. Nuri Martinez and Gill DeLeon, they didn't just sprout out of the ground. They were the product of a specific environment, and unless we talk about that environment, nothing's going to change. Even the LA Times has been forced to have to admit to the racism problem that's come out of Latin America. But why weren't they reporting on it before now? Because they didn't have to wait until this happened. The problem is this exploded so big and it was so undeniable they were forced to have to acknowledge it. The LA Times recently reported on how in Mexico you have people who are finally admitting to the rampant colorism and white privilege in their society. But the article points out that this was the result of what black people did in the United States in 2020. We need to understand that by and large, we are pretty much the only ones fighting white supremacy. Everyone else is just trying to find a comfortable place under it. This is why racist regimes all over the world get terrified when they see black people in the U.S. standing up and fighting back, because they know that we have a unique legitimacy that no one else has. There is no substitute for the moral authority of the black population of the United States. There is no substitute for the moral legitimacy that we represent. We are the ones who the rest of the world looks to for ideas and trends. They deny it, and at the same time, they also copy us. That's how it works. Now, a large part of why Latin America has all of this anti-black racism going on that's not being challenged is because there never was a civil rights movement down there. And as we can see with the white ruling class in those countries, they're absolutely determined that's not going to be allowed to happen. So why didn't it happen in Latin America? Well, that's because when the Spanish showed up, they used the same trick that the Catholic Church used when it went into non-white countries. They told everyone that they didn't care about race, that, oh, we're all just one big happy dysfunctional family, while at the same time they were enslaving and oppressing only black people. Afro-Latinos know that Latin culture is racist. A few of them have admitted it. Now they'll say it in passing, but at least a few of them have actually said it. The problem for a lot of them is they do know that they have a Spaniard in their family tree somewhere, usually someone who raped one of their ancestors, or they perhaps have some Blanco more recently who wanted a quick roll in the hay. And what this means is for a lot of them, since racial equality is not attainable, they instead look for interracial sexual access because at least for some of them that is attainable. And that's where a lot of this confusion comes in. But those white supremacists who are running those countries down in Latin America, they're not confused at all. So when these attempts to circumvent anti-black racism by the Afro-Latinos and the mestizos and the Indios fail, rather than admit to the reality, they instead dig in their heels and double down on the delusion that their problem is class, not race, because for them it's simply too painful to admit that some of those white in-laws or relatives that they like to believe they have cannot stand them. They don't want to have to admit to that. All the people of these Latin countries are blood relatives, at least that's the rhetoric that's used, but then they turn right around and treat their relatives like dogs based on their skin color, and they don't want to have to admit to that. So how do you fight racism in a region where nobody wants to admit that it exists? The answer? You don't. This has led to an enormous amount of internalized racism in Latin America. That's how you get someone like the brown-skinned Nuri Martinez, who is dogging out other people who come from the exact same country as her, speak the same language as her, have the same culture as her, and she's trying to find a way to magnify herself over other Hispanics, claiming that these people are brown people when she herself is brown. She ain't white. See, the problem for people like Nuri Martinez is in Latin America, the Blanco ruling class doesn't allow people like her to classify herself as white. Yeah, she can sit there and pine away for it and wish that she could be and tell herself that she basically is a darker shade of white, but they don't allow that down there. Either you're one of the Blancos or you're not, and she's not. But in the United States, on the other hand, where white supremacy is more sophisticated and refined, they have no problem taking some of these other groups and making buffers out of them. So that means they'll go ahead and let a Nuri Martinez show up or a Gill DeLeon, and they can get a driver's license and they can identify as white on their driver's license, but white supremacy is not fooled. So that brings us to another important point that nobody talks about. Why is it that a Nuri Martinez or a Gill DeLeon, who are brown-skinned, will simultaneously claim to be both white and people of color? Why does that happen? Well, Hispanics themselves have explained it. They don't ever say, we're not white. Instead, they say they're just not Anglo. This is how Hispanics themselves describe the difference between themselves and white society. Again, this is a class-based argument, and it strikes at the core of what is called white adjacent. This is how you have someone like Alexandria Cortez, who got on Meet the Press and said she has black ancestry, but that doesn't make her black. She also said, I've got Indian ancestry, but that doesn't make me an Indian. But she didn't dare say that I've got Spanish ancestry, but that doesn't make me white. She didn't say that. So she says, yeah, I got black ancestry, but I'm not black. Oh, she made sure she said that and said that first, because she identifies as white. That's how she sees herself. As far as she's concerned, she's a white woman of Spanish descent. This is the reality that Tavis Smiley didn't say anything about, not because he doesn't know, but as far as he's concerned, well, we don't want to upset the apple cart. As far as I'm concerned, Tavis Smiley did us absolutely no favors if he refuses to call the situation what it is. If he limits the entire discussion to just the four racists in that room, he has actually done us a disservice. The problem is a hell of a lot bigger than just Nuri Martinez and three other bigots spitballing anti-black racist strategy in a room somewhere. I think we're all honest enough to admit that Tavis Smiley is still holding that black-brown alliance card in reserve, and he figures that as soon as all this heat dies down, he'll go right back to playing that card all over again. Well, it's up to us to declare it game over. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Cloudwalker Z, Justin Marcus, Sandra Bates, Brian Ellis, and Chaz. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.